This is your host, Joe Imbriano, and we are coming to you live. So, I want to talk to you today about this gruesome story that's been all over the news lately. Before we get into the broadcast, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Joe Imbriano. I'm the Fullerton Informer, and I'm coming to you live on this Thursday Drive Time edition. Today is May 9th, 2024. All right, so I think all of you have pretty much heard about what happened down in Baja, California. 3 young men were down there on a surfing trip, okay? And they disappeared from contact on April 27th. That's the last anyone heard from them. And they were staying in a campground called San Miguel, which is just a little bit south of Rosarito. And they had gone a little further south to another camp to go surfing. And the last contact and photographs of these young men were in the campground in San Miguel, from my understanding. Their truck was found, burned, and abandoned. And it hasn't been confirmed yet, but the 3 bodies were found in a well about 50 feet down, not very far from their campsite. Now, the reason I want to bring up this issue, is because I am extremely familiar with where these young men were spending their time. I grew up in Southern California and spent my teenage years driving into Baja, California, passing through the border crossing station in Tijuana, and driving down the quota, or the toll road, or the Highway 1 of Mexico, if you will. And I have personally stayed in that campground on the beach in San Miguel, where we would light off M80s and launch my boat and catch and barbecue barracuda, and listen to Power 106 on my ghetto blaster that came in all the way from Los Angeles, that radio signal. I couldn't believe it. But my point is, I'm very familiar with Rosarito. I'm very, very familiar with Ensenada. I'm very familiar with San Miguel. I'm very familiar with the Estero Beach. I'm very familiar with La Bufalora. I'm very familiar with the terrain. Yo hablo español? And I had a lot of fin de semanas down in Mexico when I was younger. And I'll tell you that I can understand why the young people are on to this place, because it was for the same reason I was drawn to this place when I was younger. I enjoyed the ocean and fishing and just nature. And literally back in the 1980s, the fishing off of Baja California, off Ensenada, was like 50 years in the past off the coast of Southern California. It was pretty undisturbed down there. It's not developed. The fishing was incredible in the late 80s, in the early 90s. I had made many a weekend runs into Mexico, starting in 1985, 1986, 1987. 1988, 1989, up until about 1990, when I was camping in San Miguel, the same campground those young men were staying at. And at the time, I had a 74 Datsun pickup with a little camper shell on it, and I had a small boat that was about 15 feet long with a 5 horsepower outboard that we would launch down in Ensenada and go out and catch fish and come in and come back to the campground in San Miguel and barbecue what we caught: yellowtail, white sea bass, barracuda, bonita bass. Many times I had run down there with my little truck and my boat with my buddies. Well, there was one time We got there about 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a good friend of mine named Eric. He had his truck, I had mine. He followed me. I think we were pulled over twice and given the fake ticket routine where we had to pay the federales just to get them off our back. But we pulled into San Miguel probably about 1 in the morning, and we decided to go to sleep. He pitched his little tent, and I slept in the back of my truck. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by what I thought was an earthquake. And I peeped out the back of my little camper shell in the back of my truck where I was sleeping. And it was a little window that kind of opened up and down. It wasn't like a door, it was like a hatch. I stuck my head out, and I noticed there were about 5 guys trying to take the motor off of my boat. And they were helping themselves to my gas tank and my knives. And before I could even rationalize what was going on, some guy with bloodshot eyes stuck a gun to my forehead. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "Quédate callado, hijo de la chingada, o te voy a partir el hocico." And basically what that guy told me in his dialect was that he was going to blow my effing head off if I didn't keep my effing mouth shut. Now, I instantly realized we were camping in San Miguel on the beach where these guys were camping. And this was, at the time, a really neat spot because surrounding us in this campsite were a bunch of divers, scuba divers, and a bunch of surfers, and even people down there who were on their way to other destinations in Baja. And I literally, after this guy told me what he was going to do to me with the revolver on my forehead, the cold barrel of a revolver on my forehead, I literally said, "Toma lo que quieras." And I said, "Take what you want." I went back inside and just started praying to God that nothing would happen. And so they continued to try to get what they could off of my boat. Now, I grew up in kind of a bad neighborhood, and because of where I lived, I had this habit of chaining my motor onto my boat so nobody would steal my motor outboard motor out of my front yard in my house. And these guys could not get the motor off of my boat, but they were yanking on it. And that's why I thought we were having an earthquake, because you had a bunch of guys rocking my boat. And, you know, me sound asleep thinking we were having an earthquake. They were really quiet. But I realized when that guy stuck the gun to my head, he wasn't going to pull the trigger, because if he did, everybody in the campground would wake up. And then the jig would be up. And, you know, who knows what kind of weapons the other people had. Fortunately for me, I had my fishing poles and all my good tackle and gear and my expensive knives in the truck with me. But the other people in the campsite weren't so lucky. They got the scuba tanks, the spear guns, the wetsuits, the surfboards, and in some cases even a couple of generators. They made off with one of my gas tanks and a cutting board and a fillet knife. That's about all they got out of me. But what I'm getting at is this was back in I think it was 1990. So we're talking like, you know, over 30 years ago. And it was bad back then. So, you know, look, folks, the reason I bring this up is, number one, that could have been anybody. And you know what? I'll tell you some statistics. In Baja, there's about 3,000 to 4,000 murders a year. And I think there's like 3.5 or 3.6 million people in all of Baja California. It's pretty empty and it's pretty beautiful. But the people down there, I don't know, folks. You can't trust what's going on in that country. I mean, California has got the same amount of murders with 10 times the population. So Baja California has a murder rate 10 times that of California. And by the way, that's only what gets reported. You don't know. You can't trust any statistics for crime out of that country. I'm sorry. But the reason I'm bringing this up is not to say don't go down there, because this was an isolated event. As far as what happened, it's anyone's guess. I mean, all I know is a long time ago, I won't say who I was with, but, I was in my early 20s, and me and a buddy of mine, we flew down to Mazatlan, right? We spent a week down in Mazatlan when we were younger, and first day we got there, my buddy's trying to score some weed on the beach, Literally, we fly into Mexico, and my buddy's like, oh, Joe, I need to get some weed, right? And I'm like, don't do it, dude. And he's like, oh, it's okay. So anyway, I'm watching this guy, and he goes up to this guy on the beach, and they're talking. And all of a sudden, I'm looking around, and I see this federale with a set of binoculars looking at both of them. And then I screamed out his name. And, he obviously realized what was going on. But my point is that, the whole place is a setup. And, everybody's on the take down there. I think that trip when I went down there with my buddy Eric to when we stayed and got robbed in that campground, I got pulled over, I think 3 or 4 times for stop signs that didn't exist. I was shaken down for money by the cops. And, that was the last time I went down there. I mean, oh, you didn't see the stop sign? Oh, we had a report that a vehicle like yours was carrying firearms. We had a report that, the truck like this was involved in transporting drugs. We want to search your truck or whatever. You can come to the station, or we can settle it here. Let us just check real quick and give us $20. This was like 30 years ago. But you need to understand something about Mexico, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing is going on down there by accident, because by and large, the country is run by criminals, has been run by criminals. It's pretty lawless, and it's by design. And there's only one gun store in Mexico, okay? There's one gun store in the entire country, and it's almost impossible for a citizen in Mexico to get a firearm. Consequently, only the criminals have guns, and consequently, the majority of the country, if you look at the geographic layout of the civilizations in Mexico, the cities, and all of the areas where people live, the concentration of populations are really centralized, and it's almost like they have the cities corralled in. And what they do in Mexico, allow the criminals to run wild. They allow the cartels to run wild. They allow the gangs to run wild for 3 reasons, okay? Number 1, it keeps people out of the open space. It keeps people in the compact cities. It keeps people living in very controllable arrangements by allowing the open areas to be extremely dangerous and practically uninhabitable. The second thing this is allowed to do on purpose is to proliferate the amount of gun violence so they can at some point come back and blame the American firearms industry for the murders, because the guns are going into Mexico from the United States. And so there is this plan to use the legal system to bankrupt the firearms manufacturers and blame the deaths in Mexico on American gun companies. Now, using that logic, I can't wait for people in the United States to bring a lawsuit against the Mexican government for all the deaths from all the drugs that are produced in Mexico and brought into the United States by Mexicans. So we can bankrupt the Mexican government and confiscate the entire country as a settlement, right? If they want to take our Second Amendment rights away by trying to institute a legal trap by which the American court system is bound into allowing the Mexican government to sue the gun manufacturers in the United States to take our gun rights away, then it's time for us to sue the Mexican government for their failure to control the drug trafficking, the drug production, the drug proliferation, and the drug transport into the United States. Now that that's been clarified, the third reason that these gangs are allowed to run wild in Mexico is because there are certain places in Mexico that nobody goes that is being used by the militaries of the world, including areas off the coast of Baja California that have submarine access to the primary water. And so when you have a government that's run by an old man, like in Mexico, let me stop for a second. Another one of these guys with punched exhaust trying to have his valves kiss the top of his pistons by tacking out a Ford Mustang. Anyway, when you have an old man like the guy that runs Mexico, letting all this happen, pretending like he's doing something about it, the goal is truly to let the status quo exist, and that is to keep everybody in the compact cities and allow the ruling class and the military-industrial complex to be able to move troops and equipment so that no one can see it. I mean, I might as well, talk about the fact that I remember being down there driving in my truck, didn't even know where I was going. I was going into parts of Mexico. I was by myself in the late 80s. The most beautiful 3 shades of blue on the road all the way down. I remember driving down to San Quintin, fishing by the old mill and catching 10-pound bonita down there off the shore, and waking up, and the marine layer, the air was so clean, the cactus on the hills and the kelp and the blue water and just the bird population, the clams and the abalone. I mean, I ate like a king, and you can't do that now. Back then it was dangerous, but the country wasn't in complete lawlessness back then as it is now. The police were corrupt then, but they weren't as dangerous as they are now. And there are a lot of murders. I mean, I think 2 or 3 years ago, San Jose del Cabo was the murder capital of the world, for crying out loud. That place is not all peaches and cream, folks. I can understand why these young guys went down there, because it's a surfer's paradise. The nature, the natural experience, the cleanliness, the isolation, the solitude, the beauty, the connection to God, all the things that I experienced when I drove down into that country was probably what they were experiencing. Now, I don't know all the circumstances of whether this incident involving these 3 young people was a carjacking that went wrong, it was a robbery that went wrong, it was a drug deal that went wrong, or they actually witnessed some narcotraficante activity that they should not have seen. Because where they were was pretty far down and off the path. I mean, where they ended up was in an area of Baja that pretty much no one's around in. So it's very possible the cartel was using that beach for drop-off or distribution. Something might have went down and they saw it, and they could not afford to have any witnesses because, I mean, who knows? These guys, they might have saw something and gave these guys some lip. We don't know. But what I do know is that it is not safe to go into a country where you cannot defend yourself with a firearm. Let me repeat this. It is not safe to go into a country where you do not have the right to defend yourself. In Mexico, there is only one gun store in the entire country. In the United States, there are gun stores all over the place. And by the way, you think the United States is dangerous. Well, let me tell you what's dangerous, folks. The deniers of Jesus Christ, who have run the vile, filthy movie industry, music industry, print media, magazine, book publishing houses, cartoon, everything, have tried ever since they were able to invent their version of the printing press and the satanic, psychotronic, electronic Ouija board called the Hellivision and the motion picture studio, to turn the United States of American citizens into animals that would abuse their gun rights so they could take them away. And it hasn't worked. So in spite of a good 75 years of satanic mind control training us to kill each other with our guns and trying to turn us into animals by telling us we're animals in the schools, drugging us like we're animals, feeding us the certain types of crappy food that tries to make us into animals, and giving us music videos and songs and movies to make us act like animals and normalize animalistic behavior and abuse our Second Amendment, still hasn't worked. That's why they got to fake shootings and green screen stuff to get these people to pass laws to try to take the guns away. And then when they pass these laws about registration and turning them in, people don't register them and people don't turn them in. The United States is still an extremely safe place to live. Unfortunately, they do have plans to make us use our guns on each other if they collapse the currency or they do some issues with the power grid or the food supply or some sort of a cyber attack they're going to run. But the American people are not going to turn on each other. They're going to turn on the aggressors when that day happens. Believe me. You see, the plans to import mass murderers and criminality and drugs and weapons into this country is going to backfire, because guess what? Criminals and murderers are no respecter of persons. And a lot of these people that have been brought in here to subvert this country are actually going to turn on the government themselves when that day comes. That's the point, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know what happened to those three young men. All I know is that the same lure that drew them down into that beautiful, pristine wilderness along the shores of the Pacific Ocean was as beautiful now as it was when I was a young man. And, if you're not a surfer or a fisherman or somebody that enjoys the ocean, that someone has a connection with the ocean like I did and these young men did, it's hard to understand why people would maybe risk their lives to go on a trip like that. But I can tell you, driving down that highway back in 1985 and 1986, listening to my Steely Dan cassette, looking at the Three Shades of Blue, listening to Deacon Blues as I was just rolling down the road, getting ready to set up the surf rods at the next stop, cast a jig into a boil of sardines with yellowtail and white sea bass, working the bait schools, and pulling up stuff that I could hardly even get onto the beach, and then getting it onto the barbecue as we were blowing off M80s and illegal fireworks in the United States that were readily available in Mexico. It was a great time down there, folks. Didn't realize how dangerous it was because I was young and stupid. But I'll tell you now, I'm all the more wiser. And it's a tragedy what happened to these young men. But may it not be in vain, because may this issue bring to light the sad reality of the agendas at work that I've explained in this video. And may you understand why things happen the way they do. There are no accidents, folks. Mexico is not run by idiots. It's actually run by sophisticated criminals. The country is in shambles, not because the people down there can't get it together. It's because the people down there have been oppressed and disarmed, and they've been economically fleeced. I mean, you talk to these guys, down down in the Port of Art area, and there's some of these areas down there where the shrimp is and the fish, they're just absolutely amazing, and the locals can't afford it because it's getting harvested and it's getting shipped out to the highest bidder in China and Japan and the United States. I mean, it's really sad that the bounty of the coastline down there, the locals can't even enjoy it. So, it's all a controlled burn. Everything's a scam. These governments are not inept. They're not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. They put on this impression for us to fall for, that they are out of control and they're not controllable, when in fact everything is carefully orchestrated. Just look at when the certificate of vaccine ID-19 operation went into effect. Everybody had the same game plan. Everybody had the same mask, gloves, and vaccine solution. There are no accidents, folks. Everything is carefully orchestrated, carefully engineered, and planned years in advance. May God have mercy on those people who murdered those poor young men. And may Almighty God comfort the families that have lost their sons. At this point, I don't know what to say, except may it be a word of caution to all of you to not go into Mexico alone or off the beaten path, or to places that help is not available, because unfortunately things are only going to get worse down there. And things are only going to get worse here too, folks. But we stand a better chance in the United States, because for the simple reason of being able to say no to aggressors and oppression makes us so much safer. Because when you have the first and the last right of refusal, the criminals and even the criminals in the government have to think twice before they have their way with you here. All right, this is your host, Joe Imbriano. I'm going to sign off. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Share this video far and wide if you have the ability to do so. My contact information is PO Box 4121, Fullerton, California, 92834, on the web at thefullertoninformer.com. Thank you all for tuning in. May you be blessed in Jesus' name, and may you be all the wiser for listening. Take care.